to our last week, we also spoke about Tfilas Kelim, and this stimulated the shaila about people buying jars of coffee, and then let's say you want to use the jar later to use it for storing rice. Now, since again with the focus on the Rebbe Rashab, so we have actually a story of the Rebbe Rashab, and this is at the bottom of your sheet. Is the can you see? Did I share it with you yet? No. Okay. So sorry about that. Okay, share. There we go. Ah, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Ah, so now we have here. This is a quote from the Ksos HaShulchan, written by Reb Chaim Noah, who passed away some 60 years ago. He had occasion a couple of times. Once, for sure, he traveled from Eretz Yisrael, where he lived. He traveled to the Rebbe Rashab in Lubavitch, and he sometimes mentions it. He also was appointed as some time he spent in Bukhara as a rov there, b'shlichus of the Rebbe Rashab. He also spent some time as the rov in Cairo. But meanwhile, he writes the following anecdote. Talking about new Kalim, he's actually talking about opening Kalim on Shabbos, whatever. But he says, I heard from Rebbe Foel, the son of the Choster Baruch Shalom. We know him as Foel Khan. So he says, well, I heard from Rebbe Foel Khan, Amai said that the Rebbe Rashab was traveling on the train. And by one of the stations, he bought from a goy, he bought a cup with some water. And so then he's on the train, and the train goes, he's with the cup. After he finished drinking, he threw the cup out of the window. Now, this you mustn't say too loud because it's illegal to do this, yeah? But the Rebbe, he finished the cup of the glass of a drink. He threw it out of the window of the train. And the Rebbe Chaim Noah says the pshat, because there's a shaila. How can you drink from a glass which hasn't been toveled? The only reason is because when you take the glass, you didn't intend to be koine the glass. You only wanted to buy I paid for the drink. I didn't pay for the glass. It never became mine. And if that was his kavana, so then to confirm that indeed when he bought the glass of drink, he didn't mean to buy the glass, just the drink. So bepoil, he threw the glass out of the window. So this is a very interesting thing because lots of us are buying. We buy jars of coffee, etc., and we don't tovel them. We don't empty the coffee, run along to the mikveh, and then put the coffee back in the jar. And the reason for this is that you can say in the Sefer Tvilas Kelim, it's a sefer which the Rebbe mentions in the Sikha, in Likkutei Sichos. So he mentions he brings from lots of poskim. The reason is that when you buy the jar of coffee, you're not interested to buy the jar. You're buying the coffee. Okay. Now let's look at this more carefully. I use the example of a jar of coffee. It may not be the best example. Does a jar of coffee need to be toveled? Let me give another illustration. In many kitchens, you'll see a set of canisters. One that says coffee, one says flour, one says sugar, one says tea bags. Do these kind of containers need to be toveled? Let's say if they're made of metal, do they need to be toveled? So here we have a term called clay oitzar. Now I'm going to point to the place, and this is in the Dinim of Tevilas Kelim, which is in Yoredeya Siman Kuf Chof, if I'm not mistaken. So we have here a comment of Reb Kiva Eger. And here he writes, where I'm pointing to, Kosav Alova Chochome, Li Nira de Loit Sorach Tvila, he says here that the mitzvah of tvila applies to kelim which are used for serving at the table, or very important, a keli which you cook food, for example, and you make the food ready. But what about a keli? Let's say if I was a farmer and I had a sickle to cut grain, does the sickle to cut the grain need to be toveled in a mikveh before you cut grain? Let's rephrase the question. As a shoichet, the knife for shchita, does that need to be toveled? It's making food edible. Actually, it's in this week's Seder. As a ma'acheles. Ma'acheles is the knife which makes the food edible, makes the meat edible. Now here's
the food is not edible though when you shecht it.
The answer is it's not edible right away. It's only edible afterwards. It's a stage before. There we are. And here we have the Mechaber writes, Sakin shel shchita, or Sakin shemafshitin boy, the knife which is used for shechting, or the knife which is used for skinning, flaying the animal. Yesh mishoy meshein tzorch tvila. There are those who say it doesn't need to be toveled. So here we're seeing this yesod, that although a knife for shchita is obviously used as a stage in preparation of food, but it's not going to be edible right afterwards. It's going to have to go then through roasting or cooking, and never mind the kashering in between. And therefore, the sakin shchita, yesh mishoimer, there are those who say it doesn't need to be toveled. Okay. And the same thing, the knife being used for skinning the animals. However, then we have the Ramah. The yesh cholkin. There are those who disagree. It's recommended to tovel this knife without a bracha. And then the Ramah continues talking about the barzelim shemetaknin behem matzes. About you'd have a kind of roller which has pricks, how do you say, points, and it would be used for piercing, for piercing the matzahs. And you know, anyone who's been to a matzah bakery knows that you have a special roller to make holes in the matzahs, so the matzahs shouldn't blow up, shouldn't inflate. So the Ramah says also they don't have to be toveled. So the Meforshim, the Shulchan Aruch, Noisei Kelim ask, are the barzelim, these rollers, these prickly rollers, are they the same halacha as the knife of shchita, etc., which he recommends to tovel without a bracha? And they say, sure not. And they say the reason is that the knife, in other words, let's understand what's happened here. The Mechaber, the Shulchan Aruch, has said a shchita knife doesn't need to be toveled. Then the Ramah says you should tovel it without a bracha. And then we're talking about these rollers for the matzahs. What's the reason that you should tovel the knife of shchita? And is the matzah rollers the same thing? So some of the Meforshim say that there's a difference. The knife of shchita is made for shchita, but you could cut a sandwich with it. You could cut fresh meat, cooked meat with it. In other words, it's a knife designated for an early stage of food, but it could be used for ready food. By contrast, the rollers of the matzahs, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do with for fresh edible food, and it's useless for that. And therefore, what they're saying is that even a jar, even a knife, which is designated purpose, is not for immediate use. It's for only for an earlier stage, since it can be used for immediate use of food. Then it should be tovel. That's the Ramah's chumrah. So coming back to our jar for storing, so I've illustrated an empty jar of coffee to store rice. Does it require tevilah? So you can start off and say, klei oitzar, in other words, if it's a keli just for storage, it's not the kind of thing where you put in ready food. You're storing rice. I suppose chose that as an example because rice in its uncooked state is inedible. At that stage, it doesn't really need tevilah. But according to the Ramah, who says since it can be used for other foods, you could use the same jar of coffee now for rice. You could now perhaps use it for storing biscuits, for storing pretzels, and therefore it is roy to store. It's not so far-fetched that it will be used for other foods. And therefore, one would tovel it, but without a bracha. Generally, glass should be toveled with a bracha. It's a chiyuv d'rabbanan to tovel. But here, because it's a suffix, so it should be toveled without a bracha. And I want to throw in what the Shach says on the margin. He says, when the Ramah says tovel without a bracha, he says, or better still, tovel it together with other kelim, which require tevilah without any question, and then the bracha will be for both kelim. And in other words, we're seeing from the Shach, he says, if you have nothing else, okay, you'll do it without a bracha. But if you could do a mitzvah with a bracha, so don't miss out on the bracha. I just want to throw in one more observation, then I'll go to the chats, and that is. Okay. My question is the following. Why, when I go to the shop and I buy a let's say a glass bottle, of beer, may I drink straight from the, no, it's not respectable to drink straight from the bottle, but I'm talking about no one's looking, yeah? So am I allowed to drink straight from the bottle? It hasn't been toiveled. So the answer is, I didn't buy the bottle. I bought the beer. No, I'm interested in buying the bottle. So now I'm asking the following question. What happens if I buy a food in a nice jar and I want to keep the jar? And I'm thinking of a practical example. Don't see them very often, but you can buy tins of biscuits they used to be from Denmark, these fancy tins of biscuits. And perhaps you paid even a bit more for the because you're buying a nice tin. And many people would keep the tin for afterwards putting in fresh biscuits. My shaila is, how can you use the tin before you remove the biscuits? Before you use the first batch of biscuits. It's a keli. The whole heter for not having to toivel is because I didn't buy the jar. I only bought the contents. But if you beferish did buy it because you wanted the jar, so then you have a problem of tefillas kelim. Now, according to the Mishnah Brura in Hilchos Pesach, he says that what happens if a guy comes with a delivery? If a guy comes on Achron Shel Pesach, he knows that for 7 days you haven't touched a piece of chametz. So he says, Rabbi, or whatever, my dear Jewish friend, here I brought you a fresh roll of bread that you, right at the end of your festival, you should be able to. He brought an Achron Shel Pesach. No, it's going to be, if I own it, it's going to be a chametz shavel of a Pesach. So the Mishnah Brura says, you can tell him to put it down and you say, I don't want to be koine. That's what Mishnah Brura says. I have strong proofs that that doesn't work. From Ramari means a tshuva that saying, just when you want to have it in the long term, you don't want it now, but you do want it. So that doesn't work. According to the Mari means that doesn't work. So therefore, according to Mishnah Brura, you have an eitzah. You buy this tin and you say, I don't want to be koine, I want to be koine later. According to the other poskim, I don't think that works. So if you are in the position of buying one of those cans of tins with these biscuits or whatever similar example, you're buying a food in a container which you want to use the container subsequently, so then I see you have a problem of tefillas kelim. And there's one simple eitzah which you have, that you give it b'matona to a goy, and you say, I'm giving it to your matona and I'm borrowing it from it. And then once you've emptied the biscuits and you want to reuse it, at that point you will be able to get it back, regain your gift from the goy, and then you'd be able to toivel it and with a bracha.